Thank you very much, Mr. Ferrer. Now I'll turn to the board members or government representatives who would want to ask questions to the panelists.
We're working. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming today. This is, I think, in my view, a very important discussion. It's an important discussion that we have today among ourselves, between ourselves, and also in terms of talking to the public. I think we probably agree that Puerto Rico's labor welfare laws were not what caused the downturn to the economy and to the government's finances beginning in 2008 or so. I personally think it's probably the withdrawal of Section 936. I think probably most people agree with that. But I think it's important we look at these issues because even prior to the recent economic downturn, Puerto Rico had much lower labor force participation, much lower incomes, much higher poverty rates than the rest of the country. And my concern is that even a well-executed recovery plan from Hurricane Maria, something that repaired the electric grid and the rest of the infrastructure, unless it contains structural reforms to improve labor supply, that you're likely to end up where we were before, which is still a country or an island which is unfortunately very poor and is likely to lose population to the mainland. My comments, Professor Cordero, you presented a lot of data, which I think is very, very interesting. So I'll focus a little bit on that, but certainly I'm open to any other comments from the rest of the panel, because we'll touch on a variety of things. Professor, I think I characterize you say the problem, certainly for the labor supply on the island, is not a supply side problem. It's not, your argument, it's not because of labor laws or welfare incentives. And you're saying nor is it a human capital problem in terms of educational qualifications. I think I'll touch in the second, the human capital issue first. You made, I think, a convincing case that what we call quantity of education on the island is rapidly approaching that on the mainland. Quantity of education means the number of years of schooling that a person has. But quantity of education is not equal to quality of education. And quality of education is a better measure of human capital. That, I think, can be captured a little bit better by thinking about the test scores, comparing Puerto Rico to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. I pulled up, if you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, math scores, the gap between Puerto Rico and Alabama is twice as large. Alabama is the lowest scoring state in the U.S. The gap between Puerto Rico and Alabama in math scores is twice as large as the gap between Alabama and Massachusetts, which is the highest scoring state. You have an enormous gap on that. And that continues if you look at reading, if you look at different grades. Similarly, if you look at what's called the PISA exam, which is the Program for International Student Assessment, the OECD does that. I looked up data the other day in 125 different countries and regions. Puerto Rico in reading ranked 106th. On math, it ranked 117th. So I think you have a significant problem that even if the quantity of education is matching up reasonably well with its competitors, the quality of education is not nearly where it needs to be. I don't know what the problem is. It's probably multiple problems, but I think the government needs to take that extremely seriously. Thinking on the supply side incentives, I thought it would be helpful to compare a little bit to Florida, which is a state that many Puerto Ricans willingly or unwillingly are becoming very familiar with. Florida has a labor force participation rate at last check about 60% versus 38% in Puerto Rico. Poverty rate in Florida is about 14% versus 45%. Median income in Florida is 2.5 times that of Puerto Rico. I think it's worth looking. Those are outcomes you want to aim for. Those are outcomes that people are leaving Florida to aim for. If you think about labor requirements, in Puerto Rico, the minimum wage is 70% of the median wage, and in Florida is only 40%. You have much higher relative minimum wage. Paid leave, an experienced employee in Puerto Rico must be paid up to 3 weeks pay, 0 weeks in Florida. Sick leave up to 2 weeks in Puerto Rico, 0 weeks in Florida. Christmas bonus up to 3 weeks pay in Puerto Rico, 0 weeks in Florida. Maternity leave up to 8 weeks in Puerto Rico, 0 weeks in Florida. By itself, and this is standard textbook economics, by itself, the mandatory paid leave in Puerto Rico would reduce wages by around 20% relative to what they would have been without that. In other words, if you applied these same paid leave requirements to Florida, their wages would drop by a similar amount. This is just what econ will tell you. So I think part of your argument is, well, the wages are not high enough in Puerto Rico, therefore people are not working. But part of the problem is the wages are being depressed by mandatory benefits. In addition, Florida has what's called employment at will, which means you can hire or fire as you like. It makes it less risky to hire an employee. Puerto Rico is one of only 49 of 50 states have employment at will. Puerto Rico lacks that. All of these, in a textbook sense, will reduce labor supply, unequivocally. Similarly, I mean, you discussed a little bit about food stamps, receipt. In Florida, food stamps are half as generous relative to median wages as they are in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, unlike all of the 50 states, does not have a work requirement for food stamps. Florida does. If you're an able-bodied recipient without children, I think you get 3 months of receipt. After that, you have to be working, training, or employed, or volunteering. I guess my question is, looking at all these statistics, is it your position, Professor, that these policies have no effect on the supply of labor and the incomes that people receive in Puerto Rico?
I was hoping you would compare Puerto Rico to New York, or that you would compare Puerto Rico to the most progressive state, and what do you think you'll find?
If you,
that the gap is even bigger, right? Than what it could be with Florida. And is your contention that if you give Puerto Rico all the indicators that you give to Florida, that Puerto Rico's income would go up just as Florida's, and that Puerto Rico's poverty rate would go down just as Florida's?
It will not.
If we could magically just make all those tweaks, is that really what's going to drive growth in Puerto Rico? I really don't think so. I mean, I think we can spend a lot of time on the apples and apples and oranges, but I think we really need to run all these things by like a common sense test at some point.
Okay, so my question, Professor, is obviously there's other things going on in Puerto Rico: lower human capital through poor education, more bureaucracy
I can address
for
that
starting.
if you'd like.
I'm trying to ask a question. Is it your view that all the policies that I outlined for Puerto Rico, the requirements of paid leave, no employment at will, Christmas bonus, that doesn't have any negative effect on labor supply relative to a place like Florida?
First of all, one has to do kind of empirical work on Puerto Rico, looking at those variables, which I don't think you've done, nor have I. But my speculation would be that the effect would be minimal, and trivial when you compare the big picture. In other words, what I was just telling you before, that if you make those tweaks, the kind of job growth that you're going to get is not going to be the kind of job growth that's going to lift Puerto Rico's income up and poverty down to the level that those other states have it. And again, I think what will be an interesting study will be to compare Puerto Rico to Florida and to various other types of states. And Puerto Rico is a lot of path dependent. Remember, I mean, you can't just look at Puerto Rico today as if it doesn't have a history, if it doesn't have like a particular path. So that's what explains sort of the labor force participation rate. It's always been lower than in the mainland. There was a point in time in sugarcane production, which was another example of US-driven economic development for Puerto Rico, right? Whatever the US needs, Puerto Rico does. That work was seasonal. So yes, there have been times in which the Puerto Rico labor supply has adjusted to the labor demand. What I'm telling you is that labor demand is what drives the process, not labor supply. That we're here not because Puerto Ricans don't desire or want to work. There's 175,000 people in Puerto Rico today working for below minimum, not for below minimum, for below poverty wages. There's about 125,000 or more unemployed looking for work. There, I just show you there's 200,000 just in the PAN program alone. And again, first, we don't have the data. And we say, well, we speculate that people in PAN don't want to work. And then when I show the data, people say, well, I don't believe the data. We got to kind of make up your mind at some point.
No,
I say whether we and what it shows is, again, that the people are looking for work. They're just not finding it. And you can have a person look for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. If there's not an employer on the other side to bargain, they're going to go. Now, on the quality of education, first we were discussing the issue of quantity of education, right? And the first census of the U.S. and Puerto Rico found that 80% of the people didn't know how to read or write. Puerto Rico's made a humongous amount of progress. Now, I've seen the Fed study and other studies that look at test scores in Puerto Rico, and you have to look at first the test itself, and second, you have to look at the production function of the test score. right? So if you have a place that has a much higher poverty rate, and you know poverty impacts the test score, you would expect a place with a higher poverty rate to have a higher test score, everything else being the same, just because that's the way it works. So economics affects results on test scores, independent and above and beyond the effects of teachers, the effects of classrooms, and those are, interesting. There's a lot of research on that, on the effects of socioeconomic background on educational attainment scores. So you're taking a place that has a poverty rate of 46%, where 56% of the children are poor, and you're saying, here's Alabama over here.
How does that explain the international comparisons to countries that are far poorer than Puerto Rico, countries that spend less in their schools than Puerto Rico?
I don't think those countries end up testing the same proportion of the population that Puerto Rico tests. There are issues of, are you including everybody in those countries in the test? And Puerto Rico has a lot of, it's a very inclusive system. Everybody's going to get tested. I don't know that in some other those countries around the world, you're going to really have the same proportion of children that are being tested. So, of course, if you compare the kids that are more likely to test in those countries, which tend to be the kids from the higher socioeconomic backgrounds, so you have to clean all those things up if we want to make real apples-to-apples kinds of comparisons.
Okay,
I mean, otherwise,
I'll end
it
with
becomes
this.
unfair.
I'll say my reaction to this panel, unfortunately, is similar to my reaction to the previous one. There's worthwhile stuff being said, but it is the sort of thing saying we just need more spending, more investment, more stimulus. And Puerto Rico's had a lot of fiscal stimulus. When the government borrows until it can't spend anymore, that's a lot of stimulus. If we don't start thinking about deeper problems, thinking outside the box, 20 years from now, we'll be having the same conversation that we're having this morning.
I completely
say
agree
it for
with
this
you.
panel, I think for this.
I completely agree with you. And if we have a headache and we get our foot amputated, we're not going to solve our headache, right? So I'm helping you trying to have the proper diagnosis of the problem. And the proper diagnosis of the problem is that Puerto Rico's problem in terms of the labor market and the labor force is not Puerto Ricans' desire to work. It's the absence of employment opportunities.
There's no question of that.
No.
But
the sophisticated language of labor supply underneath it is an argument about people's desirability or desire to work, and the incentive structure and what the incentive structure is aligned. Let's align the incentive structure. Why, rather than saying let's cut benefits, we don't say let's increase the minimum wage, let's increase the benefits, let's pump some money into that economy, and that's really what's going to end up growing it, right? Well, again, we can have a disagreement, and we can look at data. And I think ultimately we should solve this based on data,
Puerto Rico
not
has
based on
one of the highest relative
ideology.
minimum wages in the world. Knock yourself out. I'm sorry if I sound a little frustrated, but this is an important issue. It's a really
higher
important
wages
issue.
is going to make Puerto Rico, if you increase the minimum wage in Puerto Rico, you're going to have an effect of more people working because they're going to find it even more attractive.
Because Puerto Rico...
But wait a minute. If you get like a federal subsidy on the wage, for example, a temporary federal subsidy on the wage, it's going to make a difference whether Sobrino can get them to buy a Padrino of Pepsi or whether they can get to buy some Mavi and some empanada, right? So yes, we also have a machinery problem. We need to pump money into the economy, and we need to re-engineer the economy so that consumers in Puerto Rico consume the money more in Puerto Rico, and that's going to get us some growth. But going after people's pockets, going after workers' pockets, is not going to get you the kind of growth that I think you're looking for, if you're looking for growth.
I hope you're right. I suspect not.